So we'll wait for just a couple of minutes. I'm waiting for a few more people to join. Arunima told she's joining shortly. So.
Nirpam, are you also recording the talk?
Yes. I will start the recording locally,
Okay.
right? Or
Yeah,
not
locally. Locally, yes.
Yeah. And I have started the live streaming on the YouTube already.
Yeah. That seems to be going well, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think maybe we can start. So yeah, I see there are already some audience also in the YouTube channel. So it's also time to start here. So welcome everyone to this. Yeah, what I forgot is to start recording. So welcome everyone to this 17th Annamani lecture organized by the ASIWGGE. So the Astronomical Society of India Executive Council basically formed this working group for gender equity in 2015. And among the various activities that have been taken up by this working group, one of the regular activity is this Annamani lecture, which we are hosting online for quite some time now. This is the 17th of that series. Before we start the lecture today, I just want to remind Annamani, after whom this lecture series is based, was a pioneering Indian physicist and meteorologist who carried out path-breaking research in 1950s India against all odds. After completing her undergraduate degree in physics from Presidency College in Madras, she undertook research at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. She worked with C.V. Raman on the spectroscopy of diamonds and rubies and published 5 single-author papers. However, she was not granted a PhD degree by Madras University on the pretext that she did not have a master's degree, ignoring the fact that she had obtained a scholarship for graduate studies on the basis of her undergraduate degree. She took up an internship to study physics at the Imperial College in London, but ended up specializing in meteorological instrumentation. She returned to India in 1948 and joined the Indian Meteorological Department at Pune. In 1976, she retired as the Deputy Director General of IMD and subsequently returned to the Raman Research Institute as a visiting professor for several years. During her career as a meteorologist, Annamani helped in setting up instruments for studying the ozone layer and wind energy, as well as a millimeter wave telescope at Nandi Hills to study solar radiation. She also wrote 2 books on solar radiation. So it's an honor of the WGG to host this lecture series named after her. And today we are very happy to have Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey as the speaker for the 17th Annamani lecture. Jahnavi is the founding director of Science Gallery Bangalore, and she did her PhD in History of Science and Technology from Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta. She was fellow of the Institute of Advanced Study, Berlin, was an external curator to the Science Museum, London, and a scholar in residence at the Deutsche Museum, Munich. She held a tenured faculty position at King's College, London, and is currently the Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee Visiting Professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Jahnavi is the author of Atomic State, Big Science in 20th Century India, and has co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. She is also on the editorial board for the British Journal for the History of Science and History and Technology. She was the producer-director of the documentary film Cyclotron. And of course, as most of us are aware, she is the winner of the Infosys Prize 2023 in Humanities. So we are very glad to have Jahnavi as our speaker for this 17th Annamani lecture. And I will request Jahnavi to start.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nirupam, for this kind invitation. Thank you, Astronomical Society of India and the Working Group on Gender Equity, for this opportunity to present some of my work, more recent work, for which I have had very little time given the kind of work I'm engaged in now. What I'm going to speak about today is going to be not very directly fair and square on the question of gender and equity, but rather about more broadly thinking of what inequities structure and intersect the conduct of research in India and why one might actually pay attention to it. I'm going to speak about a book that I'm in the process of editing for publication on government and science in India, which was written by an American educationist called Morehouse. The book was written in the late 1960s and between 1967 and 1970. It's a 500-page manuscript that never got published, which we are now going to actually put out into the public domain. I'm in the last stages of finishing it. I've been in the last stages of finishing it for a while now. So allow me to present to you how, in many ways, questions of inequity are deeply embedded when one thinks about doing science, doing research in India, and how someone looking at it from the outside understood it in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s, and what that might actually usefully tell us about doing science in India today. So Ward Morehouse is first and foremost known in India as an intellectual, a prominent political activist, an educationist, and a publisher in the United States. He was the founder of the Council on International and Public Affairs, called CIPA, and that was established in 1954. He was among the first activists to denounce the concept of corporate personhood in what were called the Rethinking Democracy workshops. He was also a prolific writer and scholar, having authored and edited more than 20 books in his lifetime. In India, though, Morehouse is best known and remembered most for his association with the legal battle following a gas leak at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal in 1984. He led an untiring battle in and outside India for the victims and the survivors. Alongside, he published two major books on the Bhopal question. One was called The Bhopal Tragedy, a Citizen Commission's report, with Arvind Subramaniam, and The Bhopal Reader in 2004 with co-authors Bridget Hanna and Satynath Sarangi. In addition, Morehouse also created a collection of works with Apex Press called the Bhopal Library. Sarkar and Vigyan, an over 500-page manuscript, which hopefully we will soon have in our hands in a published format, was first written by Ward Morehouse in 1967. It was revised in 1970 and then never published. His goal was to evaluate the first 2 decades of science and development in free India, and no other comparable source exists. Morehouse's correspondence with his colleagues about the manuscript led to revisions that show us how he changed his mind about the relationship between science and the state and social change. His revisions also help us understand Morehouse as an individual, but equally, this also opens up the question on a wider moment when many lost a deeply held faith in the benevolent power of science. The timing of this manuscript is vital. The Nehru era was coming to a slow end, and a new one was in the making under Indira Gandhi. Conducted in the energy of the new, the manuscript takes stock of the old. When he passed away in 2012, Ward Morehouse left behind an incomplete autobiography called The Banality of Goodness, a memoir on political change. A rough draft of a chapter survives through which we understand the beginnings of his lifelong association with India that began in the 1960s. Like for many others, this decade was an important transitional moment, and it was the case for Morehouse. He entered this decade with a strong belief that social change, social justice, and equality could be pursued through policy and education, but especially with the support of science. At the end of the 1970s, he would have significantly revised his position. Key decisions on institution building, science policy, science education, and the role of science in India's development were taken in the first 20 years after independence. And Morehouse provides us with an assessment of those decisions and the institutional landscape of science through an iterative dialogue with scientists and high-ranking science administrators. My modest goal with this talk today is restorative. I want to provide a context within which any person can approach this book as a witness of its time, as a source to better understand the conversations behind the faith in science and technology for development and equality in India. To do so, I am going to trace Morehouse's Indian journeys in a single decade from the early 1960s when he first came to India to the early 1970s when a second revised version of this manuscript got written. Researched and written in the early years of Indira Gandhi's India, this book at its heart, the restlessness about science and scientists in Nehru's India. Before going on to focus on this shift, it is useful perhaps to outline the shape of the life that Morehouse led. Ward Morehouse was born on 26 March 1929 in Evanston, Illinois, and passed away while swimming in a pond near his home in Northampton, Massachusetts in June 2012. Political activism and intellectual work were aspects of the milieu in which Morehouse's early life was shaped. His grandfather, Richard Ely, was a leader of the progressive movement and a political economist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ely fought for increased government intervention in areas such as child labor or regulation of child labor, compulsory education, and labor unions. He was denounced by his university and nearly lost tenure for allegedly teaching socialist doctrines. The Wisconsin State Board of Regents refused to terminate Eli's employment. Morehouse's father, Edward Morehouse, was a pupil of Eli's and married his daughter, Anna Eli. And Anna Eli Morehouse was an economist after her father and a sociologist of race. Edward Morehouse was also a political economist of the progressive bent. Now, Ward Morehouse also was seen to be rebellious in nature, during his early years of education. One saw this continue in his life even later. So, for example, in 1976, Morehouse resigned from the Center for International and Comparative Studies of the New York State Education Department because of what he called a disillusionment with the politics of education and a system that appeared unwilling and unable to contribute to social change. The trigger was a backlash for hiring Jack Chen, a Chinese communist scholar who lived through the Cultural Revolution and studied it as a consultant for CICS. So one sees in Ward Morehouse's approach to his work, both in the United States and later in India, a larger commitment for social good, a larger commitment to social change, to equity and justice, for which he thought science was an important and in fact a strong ally or a tool. Through hopefully this talk, I will be able to show you how his belief in a way came to change. Morehouse first came to India in 1962 with a UNESCO fellowship. He visited India thrice in the decade of concern to us, in 1962, in 1966, and 1969. And he stayed for a year during each of those times. It is worth remembering the context that enabled these visits. Triggered by the Korean War and sealed by the Suez Crisis, the United States had begun to perceive an active engagement with the so-called Third World as an imperative to make the world safe for democracy. The gradual stabilizing of Western European economies and scientific enterprise and the Marshall Plan behind them, knowledge of and assistance to the Third World became a concern for the United States, most decisively in the mid-1950s. Ideas on how and why to engage with the Third World clustered around modernization, which refracted much of the thinking in the United States about aid for and foreign policy towards the Third World. A majority of the political leadership in these parts of the world also shared the goals of modernization, even if they were skeptical of foreign aid per se. Morehouse's assignments in India on all three occasions during this decade were enabled by institutions associated with American foreign policy. He visited India with funding from UNESCO, the Ford Foundation, and the New York State Department of Education. While in the United States, he organized a conference at the Rockefeller Universities and edited the conference proceedings as well as wrote this manuscript at the East-West Center in Honolulu. It is striking, therefore, that in Sarkar and Vigyan, we do not find any reference to Walt Whitman Rostow's The Stages of Growth, which was upheld as modernization's inspiration by many at the time and later. Seen alongside other actions to which we will return, Morehouse, it appears, did not fully identify with the institutions that funded him and would gradually distance himself from them. What might explain his association and gradual disassociation with the foundations in the 1960s? When he wrote this book, Morehouse believed that science was the motor for social transformation. When he wrote the book, he could work with the foundations as they upheld his faith in the ability of science to deliver solutions to poverty, well-being and health, and development in the path towards social inequality, to reducing social inequality and social justice. This belief was widely shared across the political spectrum, including, in fact, in the Soviet Union, leading Daniel Bell, among others, to forward a convergence thesis. By the end of that decade, the consensus and the convergence on the universality of science as a tool for progress, as well as for the claims of American foreign policy to forward democracy in the Third World, were no longer tenable. The critique came from several directions, and it came strong. The questioning at home of American foreign policy following the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and environmentalism. Collectively, they shattered the belief in science as a benign force of social change, leading to publications like Small is Beautiful and Limits to Growth. Morehouse grew increasingly skeptical of the state as an agent of political and social change, which led him to distancing himself from both the American and the Indian state. 1962. On his first visit to India in 1962, Morehouse and his family, including his first wife Cynthia Thomas and his sons John and Andrew, traveled through India and the region, visiting Pakistan, Thailand, Burma, and Japan. Upon his return to the United States, he was appointed the director of the Center for International Programs and Services at the Department of Education, State of New York. Here, he initiated an international program of teacher exchange, including with India, and began to publish what were called the EYES series, EYES, like eyes. Soon after, he was instrumental to the establishment of the Education Resources Center in New Delhi for the creation of new study materials on India for schools in the United States. With the establishment of the Educational Resources Center in India, he could count on the production of reliable teaching material for his constituency. Following his year-long journey through India and the region, Morehouse continued an engagement with questions of development as they converged with his more immediate concern with education. However, Morehouse was beginning to think of questions that went beyond those of education. This was the time to do so. Modernization was the prism through which this was refracted. In the decade-long thinking and writing about science and development in India that followed, Morehouse engaged deeply with scholarship and institutions that made up the landscape of modernization. He began with UNESCO. He read the now discredited diffusionist model of the spread of science by George Basala. Especially important to the conduct of modernization as US foreign policy were the Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie Foundations. And Morehouse worked with two of them. This was an entire way of thinking about science and the state, a socio-technical imaginary, which Morehouse would eventually come to reject. However, at the beginning of his association with India and the milieu within which Sarkar and Vigyan was written, he worked within the contours of this debate as well as its institution. In New York, Morehouse discussed, so this is an interlude in 1966, so about 4 years later, Morehouse discussed his interests with three other colleagues, Frank Killer, Don Peretz, and Detlef Bronk, all of whom worked with the state of New York. In their conversations, they appear to have explored the role of science in the process of development, a topic that spoke directly to the conferences organized by the World Federation of Scientific Workers and the United Nations in these years. Their conversation led to a conference on science and the human condition in India and Pakistan. A two-part conference took place in May 1966. 30 scholars met over the first 2 days to discuss the research needs for the study of science and technology in South Asia. Following that, 125 high-ranking scientists, scholars, and public officials from India, Pakistan, the United States, and Europe attended the other part of the conference to state their opinions on science, development, and inequity. Of these, 27 contributed to the proceedings that Morehouse edited into a book of the same title as the conference, Science and the Human Condition. Contributors to the volume included, and some of them will be familiar to this audience, Ashok Mehta, Ainsley Embry, Abdur Rahman, Purushottam Kashinath Kelkar or P.K. Kelkar, Bagepalli Ramachandrachar Sheshachar or B.R. Sheshachar, Hussain Zahir, M.G.K. Menon, Vikram Sarabhai, Yelavarti Nayudamma, Carl Taylor, Sheldon Sagal, Stephen Marglin, Stefan Dedier, and Donald Horning, among others. The Pakistani Nobel laureate Abdul Salam also contributed a chapter. Together, they wanted to offer an explanation, which Morehouse also subscribed to, and which he then went on to promote. In the proceedings of this conference, Morehouse framed his work through the thoughts of C.P. Snow, at that stage still an internationally recognized name for his understanding of science, which came to prominence in the 1959 essay, Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. Here and throughout his work, Snow argued that the central problem of the second half of the 20th century was the increasing gap between rich and poor nations. We know, and I quote here, that the vast majority, perhaps 2/3 of our brother humans are living in the immediate presence of illness and premature death. Their expectation of life is half of ours. Most are undernourished, many are near to starving and may starve. But this suffering is unnecessary and can be lifted. It does not require one additional scientific discovery. It depends on the spread of the scientific revolution all over the world. Throughout Morehouse's work in the 1960s, a particular kind of interpretation of world history is apparent. Science was the bedrock of civilization, which delivered a better world and promised a better future, an equal future. Morehouse quotes Haskins on the far-reaching impact of such a revolution on the intellectual and social fabric of society, as vividly demonstrated, at least in Haskins' eyes, by the British experience. And I quote now, "This astonishing movement opened a window for the intellect onto vistas so universal and compelling that in less than a generation, the vision of a whole people was intellectually transformed." Morehouse then goes on to quote from Nehru, "Who indeed can afford to ignore science today? At every turn, we have to seek its aid. The future belongs to those who make friends with science." And we've heard this, quote several times in our lives. He was not alone in his assessment then or later. The Indian experience of science policy up to the late 1960s, which was based on the close alliance between scientists and political leadership, had the major objective to expand the infrastructural base for science and technology and education. The leadership of the first government of India after independence, so Nehru and others, provided the necessary political will and economic assistance to ensure continuous expansion of scientific organization and funding for science and technology. As of 1966, when it came to science, Morehouse was statist. One might even say he was Nehruvian. 1966 to 67. Following the conference on the human condition, Morehouse returned to India as the resident director of the Education Resources Center in New Delhi. Indira Gandhi was the newly elected Prime Minister of India. Sharada Nayak, a colleague at the ERC, recalls that one afternoon, Morehouse was to lead a group of American teachers to meet the Prime Minister. He got up from his desk, still in his cotton bush shirt, as it was called then, cotton trousers and chappal. He was on his way to join the group. His wife, Cynthia, gently suggested that he might change into a formal attire as he was meeting the Prime Minister. He obliged. Nayak remembers that during his stay, Morehouse took to what he saw as the ways of ordinary Indian life and began to enjoy being called an honorary Indian. He ate with his fingers, walked very good, and took public transport. His grandchildren would later call him Bapu. His preference for a lifestyle after ordinary Indians was also a critique of the ostentatious expatriate lifestyle. He would go on to articulate this in print, which was bound to get him in trouble. He had come well prepared for this trip, and it turned out to be an incredibly productive year. Being stationed in Delhi helped, which would not be the case later. The conference in New York, his contacts with top-level science administration in India, and his readings on science policy were up to date. In the photograph that we often see of his, and I wish I had actually brought it now that I think of it, we can identify some of his readings, and one prominent book was Scientists and National Policy Making. It was during this trip that Morehouse conducted meticulous research that later went into writing over 500 pages of the manuscript he called Sarkar and Vigyan, Problems and Aspects of Government and Science in India. He interviewed 150 scientists, members of parliament, and bureaucrats to understand science tech policy, administrative structure of science in India, and the relationship of both to India's development. Even though he does not name the 150 that he interviewed, among those he thanks in his acknowledgements are quite likely among his interviews, and among others, many of whom will be familiar to our audience, Suri Bhagwantam, Science Advisor to the Ministry of Defense, Daulat Singh Kothari, Chairman University Grants Commission, Benjamin Pyari Lal, Director General of the Indian Council on Agricultural Research, Atmaram and his predecessors, Hussain Zahir and M.S. Thakur, Director General, CSIR, Vikram Sarabhai, Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and Colonel Bashilal Taneja, Director General, Indian Council of Medical Research. Morehouse also gained access to Indian thinking on science and development in the country in building close connections with 3 Delhi-based institutions: the Center for Studies in Developing Societies, Research Survey and Planning Organization of the CSIR, and the Indian Institute of Public Administration. His close ties to scholars in these institutions meant that some of them would become long-term associates and collaborators. One of them was Rajni Kothari, director of the then recently established Center for Studies in Developing Societies. Kothari had used his grant from the Asia Foundation to establish this institution, where Indian politics and electoral behavior became an important focus for scholarly studies. Morehouse participated in the work of the data unit at CSDS and went on to publish about the Indian electoral process. His collaborators from this project later on went ahead and worked with him when he started interviewing parliamentarians and bureaucrats for his book on questions of science and democracy, science and state capacity, and administration of science. The other institution was the RSPO, or the Research Survey and Planning Organization of the CSIR. Abdur Rahman was the scientist in charge of the unit and had produced with feverish pace reports on various aspects of government scientific research beginning 1963. The reports covered topics such as expenditure in national laboratories, conservation of foreign exchange by national labs, scientific research in Indian universities, foreign assistance to scientific research, state support to scientific research in India, as well as investment in science and technological research during the fourth five-year plan. It is perhaps worth noting here that at a time of rapid growth of science establishment in India today, no such data reporting is available in the public domain. The implications, if not interpretations, of these reports are fleshed out to a significant extent in Sarkar and Vigyan. Raman had invited Brajan Gupta from Brooklyn College City University of New York to deliver lectures on science policy. Morehouse and Gupta became collaborators and discussed the chapters of Sarkar and Vigyan, and they continued to collaborate once Gupta was back in New York to produce related research. We might want to take a moment here to reconsider the context of Morehouse's first two visits to India, 62-63 and 66-67, when an energetic reassessment of India's science and technology infrastructure was in progress. Morehouse's first visit was made after the Indo-China border dispute in 1962 and in the last years of Nehru's leadership. This was the moment of heavy introspection of Indian geopolitics and the necessity for technological infrastructure to support national security. His second visit came a year after Nehru had passed away. China had conducted its first nuclear test later that year, and it was so close at the heels of the 1965 war with Pakistan. War had depleted the economy. There was a crisis of political leadership after Nehru's passing. And the Chinese test precipitated a certain crisis, at least among the upper echelons of political and scientific leadership. Unemployment was on the rise, and there was a massive drought leading to a food shortage. Indians, especially the young, were asking questions about returns on the 2 decades of investment in industry and government. The government decided to go on what has later been called a planning holiday to address the high degree of uncertainty all around. For the 3 years between 1966 and 69, there was no 5-year plan, as was the norm in those decades, but only annual allocations. The plan holiday was meant to balance out the extraordinary resource commitment to war, drought, and the devaluation of the Indian rupee and inflation. After 3 substantially instructive plans, this was a disorienting moment in national life. Indira Gandhi, upon becoming Prime Minister of India in 1966, inherited a collection of state-funded laboratories and research institutions that were not linked into industry. And an industrial sector heavily dependent on imported technology, minimal administrative mechanisms to cost balance or judge the appropriateness of imported technology, and finally, an insufficient number of engineers and technicians who were able to adapt to new technologies or, for that matter, generate new ones at home. Recent events have compelled us to explore the fullest possibilities of technological reliance, she said. It is now our endeavor to rationalize the structure of Indian science, to relate it more closely with the process of planning and development. Growth cannot be sustained on borrowed or even adapted technology. True self-reliance can come only as we develop the ability to solve our own technological problems. Some of this claim or argument is familiar to us also in these times. An interlude in Honolulu, 1967 to 68. Between April and November 1967, Morehouse produced the first complete draft of Sarkar and Vigyan while he was on a senior specialist fellowship with the Institute of Advanced Projects at the East-West Center in Honolulu. Mimeograph copies of this draft were produced at the center and shared with several of his colleagues and friends for critical comment. It is likely the only complete draft that survives, which was revised at least once in the next 3 years, which is around 1970. Morehouse was simultaneously working on 2 books while he was in Honolulu. He completed editorial work on the proceedings of the Science and Human Condition Conference, which I mentioned earlier. And he was writing this new book based on 150 interviews called Sarkar and Vigyan. The 2 manuscripts visibly fed off each other, and they were similar in their mission. A 20th century democratic scientific revolution was the answer to India's social problems of inequity. Sarkar and Vigyan was based on robust foundations of data and access to thinking at top levels of science administration in India at the time. At the East-West Center, Morehouse had the distance and the time to think this through. And in May 1968, a certain Alan from Birkbeck College, London, wrote back to him, "Your assessment of Nehru is interesting. I agree that he completely misunderstood the relationship between science and technology. Nehru led the assumption only too congenial to the Indian background that pure science would somehow promote technological progress. This contributed to a situation where, perhaps for the atomic energy people, science is divorced from production." One might even take one step ahead and conjecture, in hindsight, of course, that his next trip to India was based on the conclusions he drew from processing the material. He still trusted science and technology to deliver transformation, but this was perhaps his last Nehruvian moment. 1969 to 1970. On his third and final trip for this consideration to India, Morehouse chose not to stay in Delhi. This time, with Ford Foundation funding, he went to the Administrative Staff College of India in Hyderabad. Part of his mandate was to train civil servants on education and science policy. He retained close contacts to the Educational Resources Center in Delhi, but his main hub at this time was Hyderabad. At ASCII, he worked closely with the director Jitendra Singh and G.S. Arora. Together, they formed a unit on science and government. Morehouse spent his time studying the ways in which public administration was conducted and how it could be run more efficiently in order to deliver development and address inequity through administration. He was convinced that the best action for development was through administrative reform and increased coordination between departments within the government, which included the research laboratories run by the government. It was the logical next step to the conversations with parliamentarians, science administrators, and scientists on his last trip if things had to move and change. This was how to do it. Consequently, Morehouse came closely to associate with the Indian Association for Public Administration. In 1954, the Indian Institute of Public Administration was established in 1954, but in this journal in 1969, they published a special issue on science and government. And those named in Morehouse's acknowledgement for the manuscript Sarkar and Vigyan, like Vikram Sarabhai, Atmaram, B.P. Pal, Suri Bhagwantam, also figure among the contributors to this issue. Several were also participants to the New York conference in 1966 that I mentioned earlier. Morehouse's own article in this volume of the Indian Journal for Public Administration was called Nehru and Science, the Vision for New India. Now, an earlier version of this was written as a chapter for the book and then dropped out entirely in 1970. On one of his trips to Delhi while he was in Hyderabad, he met with the journalist Khushwant Singh, almost an institution unto himself. Singh, always the provocateur, invited Morehouse to articulate his own dissatisfaction with expatriate life. Morehouse had already refused the opulent lifestyle, including a palatial home that was given to him by the Ford Foundation upon his arrival in Hyderabad. He wanted to continue, like he had on his earlier trip, to live like his Indian colleagues. The Ford Foundation relented. But it wasn't as accommodating when Morehouse published The White Brahmins in Singh's Illustrated Weekly of India. Morehouse wrote a scathing critique of the self-indulgent lifestyles of American and European aid bureaucracy in India in this article published in 1970. The Ford Foundation, which has underwritten his contract at the Administrative Staff College of India, claimed that his contract required him to seek approval before publishing anything that concerned or named the foundation. One can say he was now openly dissociating himself also from the goals of American foreign policy. Now, Around this time, when Mrs. Gandhi is restructuring the government and a Ministry of Science and Technology is being formed in order to, bring into government the ability to address problems of inequity, poverty, and development, Morehouse published during his stay in Hyderabad a book called Science in India. Science in India had two goals. The first was to outline the structure of science administration in India, and the second to argue that science in India is insufficiently institutionalized. Morehouse believed that one of the most critical elements in the achievement of national goals in a country like India is the process of institution building. Governing elites in India since independence have committed themselves, albeit in different ways and with varying degrees of intensity, to the achievement of two interrelated goals of modernization: nation building and socioeconomic progress. India had, he felt, not moved from building organizations to building institutions. This was a serious problem in his eyes. Now, Abdur Rahman of the Research and Survey Planning Organization agreed with Morehouse's main argument. But in a bewilderingly grumpy review of the book, he expresses unhappiness with almost everything else in the book. Everything had changed, he said, since the book got written. Rahman, in his review, is also brutal in his critique of science administrators, who he claims hindered the institutionalization of science, just like Morehouse is suggesting. But Rahman felt that Morehouse's search for ways to institutionalize science in India was futile because science administrators would not yield power, a problem he might have noticed if he did not begin with the American model. Reviews come, reviews go. Nonetheless, it is not difficult to imagine that this must have caused Morehouse some concern, given that he had actually worked with Rahman on his earlier visits. A transition. There is little in the archives to tell us what happened to Sarkar and Vigyan after 1971. It is now over 50 years since Morehouse wrote the complete manuscript, and we know that he wrote at least one complete draft in 1967 and a somewhat incomplete revision in 1970. He already saw the need for a third revision of the manuscript. Politics had transformed on the ground. He had plans for a robust subsection on 1971 as India's watershed moment. He was referring to the war that created Bangladesh and general elections that followed, which saw the return of Mrs. Gandhi with a strong. He did not follow up on this. There may be many reasons why Morehouse finally decided not to publish the manuscript. Brajen Gupta remembers that university presses in the United States would perhaps not publish the book because scholars such as Myron Weiner, a renowned political scientist, thought it was not academic enough. Rahman was also not entirely hopeful of Morehouse's approach, and Morehouse's own approach was changing slowly. In a long letter in 1971, Morehouse wrote to to Theodore Long Dixon, a writer and fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, suggesting his move away from thinking on modernization to something, as he calls it, better. As for the modernization series, I will have to confess to a growing distrust of their utility in explaining the dynamics of change, at least in Indian society. The closer I get to looking at the segment of human activity in Indian society, the more uneasy I grow about the grand theoretical designs of Western social scientists. I think that the kind of work which he and others have done over the past decade and a half has been extremely important in identifying critical issues which needed more intensive explorations. But I also think that as our understanding of these very complex phenomena increases, many of these theories will be seen as stepping stones along the way to something better. End of quote. Morehouse had distanced himself from associating with the foundations, and with that, he had moved away from his access to and associations with top level of Indian science administrators as well. He spent his next sabbatical not in India, but with Stefan Dedier at the Research Policy Unit at the University of Lund. He was in Sweden writing and thinking about the question of science in India. In a critical op-ed for New York Times called the Vienna Syndrome, he critiqued the unnecessarily opulent event, the United Nations Conference on Science and Technology for Development, otherwise meant to think about ways to reduce the suffering of the poor. The question of social transformation and human betterment was now center stage, but distant from the immediate concerns of those whose lives were the object of that change. Around this time, Morehouse also began to develop a strong association with the British economist Ernst Friedrich Schumacher and the author of who was the author of Small is Beautiful. The book came at the heels of the Club of Rome's controversial report, well, now by now established as to be non-controversial, Limits to Growth in 1972. Schumacher and his colleagues George McRobbie, Julia Porter, Alfred Koenig, Mansour Hoda established the Intermediate Technology Development Group in 1966. This was a response to Cold War thinking on foreign aid and technical assistance, focusing on intermediate technology to solve the problems of the developing world. The ITDG argument was that the developing world did not require, nor was in a position to absorb big technologies of the West. The organization continues to argue for an intermediate technology as the answer to the challenge of poverty. Morehouse eventually became the chair of the ITDG in the United States in the early 1980s. Morehouse's association with the Center for Study of Developing Societies, where he first met Dedier, continued. His association with Rajni Kothari thrived over the next several years. It is in his conversation with Kothari and his colleagues that we can finally notice Morehouse's near complete disappointment with the science establishment in India and elsewhere. 7 years after the publication of Science in India, in 1978, Morehouse was one of 8 American signatories to the following statement, to a statement which was entitled The Perversion of Science and Technology and Indictment. Of the way in which, this was a statement which indicted the way in which science and technology had become instruments of a global structure of inequity, exploitation, and oppression. Foregrounding exploitation of the third world by a rich global minority, the statement asserts the absurdity of technological optimism to call for alternative tools based on a creative interplay between the saner elements in the prevailing paradigm of science and elements resurrected from indigenous scientific traditions of major non-Western civilizations. One can debate the merits or demerits of this, but this is in some ways the position that Morehouse arrived to in 1978, about 6 years before the Bhopal tragedy. Almost as a recall to Morehouse's piece on the Vienna syndrome, the statement ends with a call to arrest the intellectual bankruptcy of world conferences. One might think about a similar critique today of other major conferences being organized around climate change. On the 2nd and 3rd of December 1984, there was a gas leak at the Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. It is claimed that over 500,000 people were exposed to methyl isocyanate, gas, and other chemicals. Estimates on the deaths caused by the leak vary. The official immediate death toll was 2,259. Ward Morehouse, like many others, was outraged. He would continue the legal and political battle for the survivors for the rest of his life. He came to India every year and made many new friends and colleagues. He stayed for the fight. This part of his work is much better known in India as well as the United States. In the embattled India that he came back to then in 1984, the fault line between ideals of development and its socio-political objects lay fully exposed. On 31st of October that year, Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Yet another phase of his association with India was over. He had first arrived at the end of the Nehru era. He worked to understand and explain science policy during the Indira era, even when he continued his deep engagement with India with his work for Bhopal for the rest of his life. 1984 decisively marked the end of his direct engagement with science and technology, administration, and policy in India. In Sarkar and Vigyan, Morehouse has argued that the Western model of development was only historically bound to the West, but sociologically, he saw it as global. We are bound to now consider this a dated, if not deeply problematic, mid-20th century claim. In addition, there is at least one chapter on the historical foundations of science in India, where current scholarship have moved ahead analytically and in archival scope when compared to what Morehouse knew or could have known. In the first instance, this book is a witness of its time, a rather interesting time when the administration of science in India was being reoriented. The book has historical value as a contemporary assessment of and commentary on the first 2 decades of India after independence. It is what historians call a primary source. We learn through Morehouse's eyes what about science mattered to Indian leadership and to Indian scientists. He called the book Sarkar and Vigyan, which translates to government and science in Hindi. Morehouse had turned around C.P. Snow's book title, Science and Government. So while C.P. Snow calls it Science and Government, Morehouse calls his book Government and Science. In doing so, he appears to be making about three observations. First, that government came before science in India. And in using Hindi, that this was likely specific to India, or at least true of India in particular ways. Third, and this also because of his use of Hindi, that the strong arm of administration was located in Delhi. Bureaucratization of science was an observation to foreground in the 1960s and arguably a serious concern today. Another reason why this book is still interesting is that it gives us the perspective of an American deeply engaged with India. Morehouse thought about public policy and science in India with the aim to reduce inequality on a path to social justice. As a historian of science myself, I will argue that Morehouse's journey to writing and subsequently not publishing this book is equally interesting. It tells us what it has meant to study science and its administration in India, alongside the story of the manuscript's revision, the urgency around carving out chapters into an article and a short book, and its eventual shelving. When combined with the intense correspondence around it and the accompanying story of Morehouse's own intellectual journey, make it a telling instance of scholarly practice entangled with development practice. Today, we can look at the book as a marker of transition both for the individual and of wider historical processes. Morehouse's belief in science as a motor for social transformation diminished, in fact, as the manuscript was being revised. One might argue that it marks his move from a technocratic position to what could be called a radical one, as understood in the 1970s and 1980s. This might explain why, in some places, his conclusions are quite far away from the framing he gave his work. Science was undoubtedly the universal route to a better world, and he believed in it. Yet at the same time, he decried the binaries between the traditional and modern as unhelpful. He lamented the measure of research and development as a percentage of GDP as at all useful, and even argued that the assumption that investment in science must lead to economic growth is deeply problematic. Though his assumption science has succeeded in mesmerizing more than one legislative body throughout the world, Morehouse ends by suggesting that Western provincialism, which underpins most studies on science in the second half of the 20th century, limits what we know about science more generally and its place in India more specifically. It is hard to miss the changes in the thinking about science in India at this time. Given his close association with the Center for Study of Developing Societies, Morehouse must have been involved in the discussion around three books that were published towards the end of the 1970s. All three were strong critiques of what one might call Western science, although I find that phrasing deeply problematic. J.P.S. Uberoy published Science and Culture mainly as a critique of the Western positivist tradition. The following year, Claude Alvarez published Homo Faber, Technology and Culture in India, China, and the West, and called for epistemic justice towards non-Western scientific traditions in India. And finally, Ashish Nandi published Alternative Sciences, Creativity and Authenticity in Two Indian Scientists, Jagdish Bose and Ramanujan, as alien insiders in the world of science and their understanding of Indian tradition, which gave them a creative ability for creative dissent from Western science. It is curious that Mohandas Gandhi is mostly missing in Morehouse's manuscript. It is all the more curious given that the three books that I just mentioned do not ignore Gandhi. And he knew the authors of all three. The one reference we do find is through Nehru in Frank Moraes's book, Nehru, Sunlight and Shadow, where Morehouse posits that Nehru was strategic and Gandhi was tactical. That's it. Missing also is a reference to the sustained work leading up to and after the establishment of the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, and more generally, the People's Science Movement in India. And missing in this book is a direct engagement with the debate on appropriate technology led by, among others, Amulya Reddy at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Perhaps as Reddy's work on applied science and technology for rural areas began just around the time that Morehouse gradually began to give up on the science for development imaginary. And yet, and with this I will conclude, this book is necessary reading not only as a primary source or for historical reasons or for the interesting intellectual journey of its author, but because of its crying relevance to contemporary debates on science, technology, and development in India. The book is a reminder of questions already posed, discussed, debated, discredited, ignored, or abandoned in the past. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jahnavi, for this engaging talk on this subject. So now I see that some of my colleagues are here. If there are questions and comments, we can start that. If you have anything, please raise your hand. or you probably will be able to unmute yourself and speak. So maybe I can start with a question that came to my mind while I listened to your talk. In fact, this entire aspect, I don't know if it is just my ignorance, but I was not at all aware of the aspect that you talked about. I knew very briefly about his the legal battle connection for the Bhopal gas tragedy, and the name is familiar on that context. But this particular aspect, at least to me, it was completely new, and only after I saw the title of your talk, I looked it up a little bit and started seeing some of the things. So in your opinion, what is that? Because this is something which is a very important aspect of the science and policy in India overall, and in a very important period of time. And somehow that part is, again, I don't want to generalize, but I feel is like not well known and or discussed much and so on. So why is that? What it has moved into sort of in this unknown domain in a way?
Yeah. See, we don't, I mean, history of science is not a discipline really, no, in India. I mean, we don't train people to do it. We don't have degree programs. We barely have, and even colleagues of mine who work on history of science often work on histories of imperial India, right? Like science under colonialism, so to speak. So establishment of disciplines, Asiatic society, so on and so forth. I mean, one reason for that is that there are proper archives to be able to write this history. But for the period beginning, say, the 1940s onwards, there are no reliable archives to even write these stories. Because we don't maintain institutional archives, we don't maintain personal papers, and it's incredibly difficult to access them even when they exist. So as a result of which, it's actually difficult even for someone who's interested to write that history. Forget the fact that, there isn't actually adequate training available to do rigorous history of science in India, right? So I think that is at least one reason why we don't have enough about these aspects of our own history in the public domain. The second is also we like, I mean, in a way, and again, this is not unique to Indian society, but, certain things remain in public memory or, memory of the scientific community, and other things don't. And in a way, that image of the scientist in a lab who has nothing to do with the rest of the world, whereas actually it is pretty much the rest of the world that's shaping what is possible and not possible to do in the lab. We would prefer to actually ignore that, right? Because that's and again, it's not a conspiracy of any kind. I mean, that's the approach, right? Like that just makes doing science possible. And so we just kind of let it go by the wayside. And like I said, this is true also of societies elsewhere. But in India, it's particularly the case because then even when you want to do it, there are no archives to be able to do it. So I think those are probably a couple of reasons I can think of. And I mean, the second reason, as I just said, we like to forget it also because we've come to believe, that science and policy or science and politics have very little to do with each other, and science is apolitical. We like to sort of, or that administration is only incidental. It's not sort of, inherent or integral to the practice of science. Whereas, time and again, as history shows us, that's actually not the case, and that's not the case anywhere. I mean, nothing unique about India, but in India, it's especially true because most science in India is state funded. So so in order to kind of create this sort of, socially distant image of the scientist and science as a pursuit away from society, away from history, allows us to also forget this. So, so there's no chance to actually put this back in the public domain.
Yeah. So I see there is a question from Shobhana Narasimhan in the YouTube channel, and she asked, Do you think Morehouse saw scientists or science as complicit in the Bhopal gas tragedy?
So I don't get that impression from what I have read of Morehouse.
Mhm.
He certainly sees the Indian state, the American state, and Union Carbide, and later Dow, as complicit. So the administration, the government, etc. But I think I did not get the impression that he saw scientists also as complicit. He probably saw them as not doing enough,
I see.
or that there were some scientists who were with him in this fight, both in the United States and in India, but they weren't enough of them, right? Like, so even he might have missed missed the numbers. There were some of them, but he per se did not make an argument. No.
I see. I see. Okay. So there is a question from Ravinder.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Jahnavi. I find the Sarkar and Vigyan an interesting theme. And I'm curious to know from you, as a historian of science, how do you see the relationship between the political and scientific leadership of a country? And more specifically, like, what was the nature of this relationship during the Nehruvian era and how it has evolved over the years?
So I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to kind of, just mark out big trends. So I've said this several times in other contexts. The Manhattan Project changed how science and the state, in a way, or science and government came to relate to each other, right? Like, there was no such massive project. During the First World War, there was poison gas, but and some research in acoustics that sort of fed into, war effort, basically, but which was fundamental scientific research. But the kind of budget scaling and integrals, and how scientific research got integrated into a nation's ambition and warfare was unprecedented. And so the Manhattan Project changed the nature of the relationship between science and the state. The Cold War in many ways consolidated that, right? Like, so if you see with Sputnik in 1957, John F. Kennedy goes ahead and says, we are going to put a man on the moon. So national ambition, right? Like, so superpower rivalry was expressed in ambitions for science and technology. It wasn't that we will kill X number of people, or we will bomb X number of, schools and hospitals, or we will take X number of prisoners of war, but it was, we will put a man on the moon and we will show you that we are better than you, right? So that was the manner in which the Cold War allowed for national ambitions or statist ambitions to be realized, that we will have a higher GDP than you will. We will, build the AK-47 that can travel across. I mean, the AK-47 is emblematic, right, of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union exported the AK-47s across the world. I mean, almost all of Africa's civil wars are fought with the AK-47. And in this country as well, the AK-47 is a legend. A legendary weapon. I mean, I don't condone it in any way, or nor do I condone war in any way. But this is how things got manifested, right? So science and engineering feats became embedded in statist ambitions, in statist projects, in ways in which it wasn't the case before the Second World War, or the intensity with which it wasn't the case before the Second World War, and that became true also of India, right? And this is something I tried to kind of grapple with in my first book, where 1945, when the first use of atomic weapons came very came just before India's independence, 2 years before India's independence, right? And as a result of which, the Indian state also then, Indian political leadership, Indian bureaucratic leadership, and scientific leadership also saw value in embedding the ability for generating research that allowed for a nation's defense to be structured into how the government was made, right? Like, so what kind of agencies are put in place? What are the funding mechanisms, highly controlled and centralized funding mechanisms, etc., that came into place? Now, again, this is happening across the world. This is not true only of India, but in a country with resources that are less than other countries. So just to give you an example, which again I have used several times when I speak, we often say that, the Indian nuclear establishment, so to speak, TIFR, BARC, etc., was centralized and took all the resources for physics and nuclear physics research. This is and therefore it is statist and it is sort of authoritarian, etc. But this was the solution. The scientific, administrative, and political leadership did not see any other viable way. Now, whether for good or bad is something one can opine on, but this was the only way available to do to them, because if you look at it, the Americans in many ways had huge resources at the end of the Second World War compared to other countries. And even there, research had scaled up so much that you saw the establishment of Brookhaven and Argonne and other labs, right? Like, so where several universities came together to create large labs because one university couldn't afford to have such a large facility. But a better example is the establishment of CERN. Even nations couldn't afford large facilities. And then the Europeans came together to establish, the Americans supported the Europeans to come together and establish one nuclear facility for research, right? So that they had the ability to talk to people in the United States. And so, what was a country like India supposed to do at this moment, right? Like, other than create a facility that at least stood some chance of doing something that was part of this larger sort of global ambition, right? If you wanted to be considered, or if you wanted to walk the path of becoming equal among equals. And so I think it is in this context, the context of the Second World War and the Cold War, that the relationship between science and the state in India also got shaped. And there are problems that were specific to India that also then came to be addressed along the way. So if you see food security, right? Like, we call it food security today, but food shortages, which meant that the Green Revolution became a necessity, right? Like, in order to not have to depend on import of food grains or have to have famines and droughts. So the Green Revolution and research on high yield varieties became a part of, that process. So effectively, it's the coming together of a paradigm for what states are supposed to do, what states' ambition should be, but also the welfare state is a creation of creation at the end of the Second World War, right? Like, so if you see the establishment of the National Health Service in the United Kingdom and so on and so forth, the idea of a welfare state that takes care of its citizens also sort of, how should I put it, promoted by the Allies as a counter to communist revolutions, right? Because there are two powers, there's the Soviet Union and there's the United States. And if you did not want, in many ways, the idea of a communist state to succeed, then you better start taking care of your population and make them feel like that they're cared for. Social democracy, welfare state, gained purchase, and there were many people, very, very strong political leadership that fought for the idea of the welfare state, including in India, which meant that then again research was sort of meant to address these concerns as well. So I think the White Revolution, meaning the Dairy Revolution, the Green Revolution, assistance for reproductive technologies, research in particle physics and nuclear physics, all of these became a part of India's desire to build state capacity through research to deliver a strong and sovereign state.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jahnavi. I think.
There any other comment, question from anyone else?
Yeah.
So,
Arunima,
yeah.
Sorry, Nirupam, I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a very naive question. So you have given this talk in the light of the Bhopal gas tragedy, and it was very interesting. It opened up a new perspective to people like us. Can we, extend this idea, like the linking up of government policies with science and technology to any other, other than the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, to any other instance?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you just help me understand it better?
You have given now the example of the Manhattan Project and the linking of the government policies and the Soviet Union versus the US.
Yeah,
I was thinking about similar instances in the context of India, our country.
Yeah.
Other than the Bhopal gas tragedy, I mean, Bhopal gas tragedy is not linked with any development or any policy. But I'm saying in the context of the current policies or any other policy in the past,
Yeah.
to help us
Yeah.
understand this.
Linking of science and the state.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Bhopal, I mean, again, so these are, see, instantiations can begin anywhere, right? Like, I mean, the Union Carbide plant was sort of producing fertilizers, right? For use in Indian agriculture. So in many ways, it is it's deeply embedded. I mean, again, but I don't want to go down the right route of everything is connected, although Carl Sagan would be very happy with that. But to give it, so the Green Revolution is another example, right? Like where it took off because food shortages had to be addressed, for example. So how do you bring research, state policy, and action on the ground together, right? Like, and so the Green Revolution is a very, very good example of that, because it's research, right? Like, and often what I have to do, and which is not a question, which is not a problem with this particular audience, is that many people conflate science and engineering or science and technology. We talk about science and technology sort of, as if they're the same thing. And we obviously know it. I mean, this audience definitely knows that, they're not the same thing. That's why I mentioned the Green Revolution and sort of agrology or agronomy and sort of research into seeds and things like that. I'm wondering what other fields there. I mean, there's lots. Then they might not be as spectacular. I mean, the space program is, again, largely engineering, but also some science. It's a fairly spectacular project, of course, ever right since the beginning. The nuclear project as well, both the project in itself, but also things ancillary and around it, which brought the state, and electronics, research in electronics. Although it's engineering sciences, but one can kind of, look at it kindly in that way. So the early 1960s gave a big boost to research in electronics and electrical engineering sciences, because in 1962, it was felt that the Indian armed forces found themselves inadequately equipped to address the Chinese aggression, whatever one might call it, because we lacked in our ability to deal with electronics. So it's both in terms of equipment, but people who were able to do it or even make it back home. And the other thing to remember is that some of these technologies, especially when it comes to the state, and sort of geopolitics, is that many of them are dual use technologies. And so in effect, export controls come in very, very strongly. And so many times you have to actually then think of how would you do that research here or produce that technology here, because you can't kind of, meet the market. And it can be anything. Just after the Second World War, for example, you couldn't buy silk balloons for cosmic ray physics because the Americans refused to sell them, because they said your balloons will fly high. You can take aerial imaging of, X, Y, and Z, and therefore no. Right? And so it can range, and then the Egyptians sold the silk balloons to India. So it can range from that to sort of being denied supercomputers and therefore making flow solver in India. What research we did with it is, of course, again, I wish there were historians of science working on it for us to understand. But where it comes to statist ambitions, dual use technologies are interesting. And they're also ones that they're also spectacular, and they're the ones that get most attention from both the state as well as the the public. There will be others that don't get as much attention and or get attention in due time. Like, for example, until a few years ago, artificial intelligence wasn't like a how should I put it? It was a borderline dual use technology, but now it's very clearly dual use technology. And the export controls are like, they've just come down like a guillotine on it, right? Like, and that's going to be the case for the next few years, for example. So yeah, so it's one can parse it. It's an interesting question. I'll sort of think about it more and sort of think of or sort of more examples which are sort of very, very rooted in research. Yeah, thanks.
Jahnavi, just a quick follow-up question on this. Will you also put things like, for example, say setting up certain research and teaching institutes by the government also in
Yeah.
the same basket in a way. For
Absolutely.
example, ICERs, like the decision of setting up places like ICERs, or even a much earlier time, this radio astronomy group starting under the Department of Atomic Energy, because
Absolutely.
someone must have been able to convince higher up in the government that this is what is the, so they will also probably come in that basket.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Like, I mean, if you see the reports that were behind the setting up of the IITs, a thinking not specific to its time, of course, but not very different from that is what also led to the establishment of ICERs, right? Because we simply, I mean, if you look at the reports of the Scientific Manpower Committee report in the 40s, and the kind of arguments they make about what's missing on the Indian landscape. I mean, today, if you take the report, there are many things that are very, very similar. We haven't, in many ways, been able to satisfactorily address many of those concerns. And they range from not having enough and well-trained technicians to enough and well-trained engineers to enough and well-trained scientists. And yeah, I mean, it's of course, we have more resources today than we did earlier, but the problems still do remain the same. But you're right. To simply answer your question, you're absolutely right. Policy is informed by, in many ways, questions that need addressing, right? And in a country where most science research and engineering work is funded by the state, then a status agenda or the requirements of the state do become important.
Sure. Yeah. So there is another question from the YouTube live, and I will just read it for you. Says, from a historical perspective, what are your opinions on consolidation of funding sources under the NRA? Have such a transition in the world led to happier scientific communities elsewhere?
Okay, so this is as a historian, I mean, I find this question interesting, and I'm watching it from a distance, because the first time the idea for such a foundation or a council came up already in the mid-40s, when the NSF was set up in the United States, because Vannevar Bush's report that led to the establishment of an arm's length body to fund independent research was read in India, read very seriously. Editorials were written about it, among others by Meghnad Saha, and A.V. Hill, or Archibald Vivian Hill of the Royal Society, also recommended the establishment of such an agency in India. So I think both at that time and in the lead up to the sort of suggested establishment of one today, the desire to have an arm's length body has been very strong, although we don't seem to be going that way. So consolidation or not, I think the need for a funding body or several funding bodies that look to fund research and is governed in a way by peers, right? Like, and not governed by, as I was just speaking about, agendas that are a priori to the submission of proposals. Now, of course, that's a beautiful universe that exists nowhere, because I mean, we know that there was a time when anything nano would get funded. Today is a time where most AI sort of interesting proposals on AI will likely get funded than, say, others, etc. So we know that there is no such thing as an objective system, but we always try for more and more fairness, right? Like, and more how should we put it? Like a coverage, so that better research is done, frontiers get pushed, new ideas come up, bright minds get the funding they need to do the work. So the scientific community in many ways tries to do that, and sometimes fails, sometimes succeeds, fails in some ways, succeeds in other ways, etc. But I think that arm's length principle is a very important one. And one of the reasons why Vannevar Bush argued for it in the 40s very strongly was that the Manhattan Project, again, had changed the nature of research done in the universities. Much of it during those 5 odd years, or well, probably, 5 odd years, and after, was contract research for the Department of Defense, for the Department of Naval Research, for, so on and so forth. And so how do you put back money into the universities, and how do you put researchers back into the universities such that they're able to do research at the scale at which they need to do it to push frontiers at all? That was the sort of broad reasoning behind the setting up of the NSF, right? Like putting people and therefore research back into the universities without being tied to a contract for a particular kind of deliverable. So if there is to be a National Research Council or a foundation, one would probably want it to fund research that is otherwise not getting funded, because it pushes frontiers, but it has no sort of immediate value for anything that can be realized right now, right? And we all know the value of such kind of research. I mean, the mRNA vaccine, for example, I mean, the jury is still out. We'll find out in the next decades how it went, etc. But the fact that we could push it in a year is because there was enough research happening before, for decades. And so how do you fund that kind of research, right? Which is not tied to an immediate goal. How do you allow for blue sky research to happen, new ideas to emerge, for people to have the autonomy to decide or pick original research questions, which might or might not appeal to anybody, right? Like and of course, it's very likely that even an independent body might find something completely out of whack, but they're likely to probably, at some point, at least in some small percentage, consider it, right? We usually call it the conscience quota, when it appeals to your conscience, saying, yeah, why not? Let's give it a chance, kind of thing. Whereas, so I think so, it's an ongoing debate. It's an ongoing debate since the 40s. And I don't think we are close to a resolution on that with clarity in India. It might take time. It will take time, and one doesn't know which direction it will go in. A lot will depend on the kind of leadership that is encouraged both among the scientific community and between the scientific community, but also political leadership, the nature of the ministry, what ideas endure persistence. Cannot speak enough on behalf of persistence and perseverance. It's hard work. It's hard work to change things, or it's hard work to institutionalize something new. Even if the debate and ideas are older, the fact that it has to be instituted, which means it has to be backed not only by operating procedures, but also money, right? And the minute you say hundreds of crores of money have to go into it, then where is it going to come from? And the minute you say where is it going to come from, then a range of other questions come into play. Some more convincing than others, but depending on who you are, it's not easy. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done.
Okay, yeah. Any other question? I don't see any other question in the YouTube channel. Anything else from our audience in the Zoom?
Yeah, Nirupam, maybe a short question. So, Jahnavi, you mentioned in passing Carl Sagan, and we know that he was a very strong advocate of literacy of science and also the question of public understanding of science. And he also tried to relate it to the science and democracy. And so if the public is not well informed about the science, then the decisions and the policies, they are all left into the hands of politicians and maybe to some extent the science administrators. So in this whole discussion, I think that part is, I find it a little bit missing, because if things have to be decided by the politicians and left to scientists alone, then I'm sure, there would be many areas that would be left unaddressed. So you want to just comment on that, basically public understanding of science in this context.
Yeah. So, several things to it. My new work, Science Gallery Bangalore, which is, one of my main mandates is to think about formats that will allow me to create an institution that is a two-way bridge between research and the public, right? And I think that's critical, because it can't be a one-way bridge.
Yeah.
It can't be that the public becomes more informed about science, because then the culture, both the cultural authority, but also the knowledge resides with the scientific community alone.
Yeah.
And the public has no say or in what they need to understand, how they need to understand, why is something being studied at all. And in many ways, then what we are not doing is creating collectively a more dignified life where one knows things, right? Like there's a dignity that comes with knowing. There's a dignity to possessing knowledge. And I think unless we are able to create forms where people acquire that knowledge, they're not given that knowledge, but they acquire that knowledge because they begin to see the value of engaging with it, we are not going to reach meaningfully any realization of the words science, public knowledge, democracy, public good, etc. Right? Like these will remain empty sort of words, because I've said this earlier, you will hear me say this again and again. We are a society where for millennia we have been okay with the fact that knowledge is meant only for a few in society. That knowledge is not a common good, knowledge is not for everyone. And we're beginning to change that, right? So that is going to take time. Many of us are in public, I mean, I'm not at this moment, but many of us have been part of public institutions funded with taxpayer money, where, even for someone like me today, to enter the campus of a research institution, I have to make an entry. I have to tell what purpose I'm there for, who I'm meeting, why I'm meeting, and my exit from the institution is also recorded.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not talking about, the atomic energy establishment or something like that, where security is of a prime concern for other reasons. I'm talking about regular institutions. Why? Why are we so averse, even as public institutions, to the presence of the public on our campuses? Why do we have one open day in a year? Why are we not, and it's hard. I'm not saying that, everyone has to kind of, yeah. So I think coming back to your question about, understanding is something that has to be generated by establishing the relevance of the pursuit of knowledge socially, collectively. I think we have to give up entirely talking about excellence versus relevance, because often it's like, oh, this is excellent science, but it's not relevant to everyday life. I think that is actually a fallacious argument, because excellent science is relevant because it is dignifying of the human mind, right? And that's why we pursue fundamental knowledge. And I think all of society needs to be able to understand that in order to take pride in it.
Yeah.
And the pride shouldn't be in ways of, shouldn't necessarily be in spectacular technologies that, there's a rocket that's, or we've landed on the moon, or, there's a rocket, or there's a nuclear weapon, or, the fastest car, the largest this, the largest. No, it should be about these things that make up everyday life, right? Like, scientists go to work every day. They sometimes get bored as well. And I mean the human, social, and natural sciences. Life doesn't look like spectacular on a day-to-day basis, right? So how do you bring that in? And in fact, that was the thinking behind my making the film also. I made a film called Cyclotron, which is about the world's oldest functional particle accelerator. What does everyday science look like, right? And I think we need to talk about this more. We need to put this out in the public domain, create better formats. And not everyone has to do it. This is the other thing. I was the other day in a part of a panel to discuss science communication. And it was like, oh, we should train our scientists to do this. Not everyone's a communicator. Not everyone's driven to communicate. Not everyone's driven to kind of, talk about their research. They might be shy about it. They might not like people. They might, all sorts of things, right? But that doesn't mean structurally there shouldn't be ways to put research into the public domain. And I think those are the things we need to create, which means we need to feed ancillary disciplines like sociology of science, history of science, philosophy of science, science journalism, and train, have rigorous training for people who are able to talk about science, right? Not everybody has to become not everybody has to listen to a talk about science in order to become a scientist. They should be able to listen to it to understand what it means to do work with your mind, right? Like you do work with your hands, to do work with your mind. It's not magic, it's work. How do you make that visible, right? So I think that, again, it's not a quick path, it's not an easy path, but it's also not rocket science. I mean, actually rocket science, I shouldn't say that. It's also not sort of, impossible. People have been doing it, people do it. I think it needs to happen more at scale, happen with a certain kind of commitment. We need to kind of also question our highly misguided hierarchy between the human, social, and natural sciences. There needs to be a general sort of, respect for people. We are a highly stratified society. We love stratification. I mean, the way in which we've classified our society is quite amazing, and detrimental to, our own transformation, our ability to build sort of, a more equitable society. So I think a lot needs to happen, and a lot of people have thought about it, have said things about it, and all we can do, I think, is continue to do good work, continue to sort of have a commitment towards changing things. I mean, you read Shobana's question. Shobana's in the audience. She's been working with, in different ways, both in India and abroad, to address the concerns of women in science, to help bring more women into science, to help girl students, think more positively about their presence in science, even in the face of, hostile workplaces or discrimination, things like that. So I think all of us do our bit, and, one day, hopefully it'll all add up and things will change. I mean, I'm generally sort of a pessimist, but I'm not cynical. I think things will happen, but it's a hard one. Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, there are days when I'm less hopeful.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Okay, I think it has been quite a long session already. I will still ask a very quick small question. When you look at the life and work of Morehouse, of course there are so much from there to learn, which has so much relevance today, and this broad context of the science and policy and its connection with the broader equity framework. Yeah. Do you see anything specific which is also related to gender equity aspect in his life and work? That with the gender equity aspect.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't see him speaking specifically to the gender question, but I see in his life. So his first wife, who died, and then he, after a few years, he married Caroline Oppenheim, who I've been in correspondence with. So in his what I see in his biography is a life where he has been able to both relate with women, but also include women as partners in the quest for his understanding of what equity and equality might be. But I haven't come across a piece specifically addressing gender, and I'll actually pay attention when I go back. I'm in the last stages of looking through his pieces to send this off to the publishers. So I'll look for that, and if I find something, I'm sure I'll make a note of it. But thanks for that question.
Okay, so so I just check once more. Finally, yeah, I don't see anything else in the YouTube live. No other comments or questions. Don't see any other hand raised. So maybe we should wrap up the session now. Thanks a lot, Jahnavi, for this very engaging talk and the discussion, and particularly, taking your time off on a Saturday and being here with us for more than 1.5 hours. Thanks a lot, and we have enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you, Nirupam, for the invitation. Also, thank you for sort of creating room for me to talk about structural inequality in a sort of in various registers. I think these questions are also important for how we do science, or are able to or not able to do science. So it's meaningful for me, and as I say to my colleagues, after 6 years of being with the Science Gallery, I relish every opportunity where I'm able to talk about my own research. So I thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay, so with that we close the session, and thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you again very soon in the next Annamani lecture.